The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly beneath the failing helicopter, a canvas of pine and stone painted in the amber light of late October. Staff Sergeant Declan Reeves had seen enough combat zones to recognize when a mission was about to go catastrophically wrong. The RPG that struck their tail rotor had been expertly placed, the kind of shot that spoke of professional training rather than lucky militia work. Now, as the aircraft spun toward the earth like a broken toy, Declan found himself thinking about his brother Jake, always about Jake, and wondering if this was how it had felt in those final moments in Iraq 18 years ago. The impact came with a violence that defied description. Metal screamed, bodies slammed against restraints. Declan's femur snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, and he felt rather than saw the compound fracture tearing through muscle and skin. The world became a kaleidoscope of pain and confusion as the helicopter punched through the roof of what appeared to be some kind of facility, coming to rest at an angle that suggested structural damage far beyond simple repairs. Through the haze of shock and gathering darkness, Declan heard voices, professional voices, calm voices, the kind of voices that belonged to people who had seen trauma before and knew exactly what to do about it. Hands moved over him with practiced efficiency, checking pulses, assessing injuries, prioritizing treatment. He tried to focus on the face above him, but his vision kept sliding sideways, refusing to cooperate. "Don't move." The voice was female, carrying just a hint of a British accent beneath its professional composure. "I need to check your spine first." Declan managed to focus enough to see her clearly. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a severe braid, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance. She wore surgical scrubs, but there was something about the way she moved that didn't quite fit the image of a civilian medical professional. Her hands, when they pressed against his neck, feeling for vertebral damage, bore the calluses of someone who had spent significant time on a rifle range. Around them, the facility buzzed with coordinated activity. Other medical personnel, he counted at least 8, moved through the wreckage with a kind of efficiency that suggested extensive trauma training. They were extracting his team members from the twisted metal with a competence that would have impressed the best SEAL medics Declan had worked with. The facility itself was larger than it had appeared from the air, with multiple wings extending in directions he couldn't quite track through the morphine haze that was beginning to cloud his thoughts. "Ma'am," Declan managed through gritted teeth, fighting to maintain consciousness, "you need to evacuate your staff. This area isn't secure. We were being pursued. Enemy forces will be here within minutes." The woman looked up from her examination of his shattered leg. For just a fraction of a second, Declan caught something in her expression that didn't belong on a civilian doctor's face. It was the look he'd seen in the eyes of the most experienced operators just before they went into action, a kind of cold calculation that weighed variables and accepted consequences with equal measure. "I'm Dr. Brennan," she said, returning her attention to his wounds. "This is my facility, and these are my patients. I'm not going anywhere." Declan wanted to argue, wanted to explain that whatever medical ethics she thought she was upholding would mean nothing if the hostiles pursuing them breached the facility. But the morphine Dr. Brennan had administered was beginning to take effect, pulling him down into a darkness that felt both terrifying and seductive. His last conscious thought was a fragment of memory, Jake's voice on a radio calling for help that never came, dying in a medical facility that couldn't defend itself. When consciousness returned, it came with the distant sound of gunfire. Declan's leg was immobilized in some kind of advanced brace that looked far too sophisticated for a rural medical facility. IV lines fed into his arm, delivering fluids and probably more pain medication. His mind felt clearer than it should have, given the circumstances, sharp enough to recognize the tactical situation developing outside the facility's walls. The lights had been dimmed to blackout conditions. Through a window to his left, Declan could see muzzle flashes in the tree line approximately 200 meters out. He counted at least 15 distinct firing positions, which suggested a force of at least 30 to 40 hostiles, depending on their tactical doctrine. They were advancing in coordinated bounds, professional and patient, the kind of enemy that didn't make mistakes. Dr. Brennan appeared at his bedside, but the transformation was so complete that for a moment Declan thought she was a different person. Gone were the civilian scrubs, replaced by tactical clothing that looked military in cut, but bore no identifying patches or insignia. Her hair was now braided tight against her skull in a style that would fit beneath a helmet. And for the first time, Declan noticed the scars on her hands and forearms, the kind of marks that came from combat, from close quarters, fighting from a life that had nothing to do with civilian medicine. How many of your men can fight? She asked without preamble, her British accent somehow more pronounced, now clipped and efficient. Declan tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his ribs despite the medication. 3, maybe 4 if you count Johnson, but he's got a concussion. Doc, you need to listen to me. You need to evacuate your staff immediately. We'll hold them off as long as we can, but that won't be necessary, Dr. Brennan interrupted. I need you to stay here and watch the patients. Can you do that? The question caught Declan completely off guard. In his world, in the world of special operations and military discipline, it was always the warriors who protected the civilians. The idea that this doctor was suggesting something different, that she was giving him what sounded very much like an order, defied everything he understood about how these situations worked. Doc, I don't think you understand the tactical situation here. There are at least 40 hostiles moving in on this position. They're well-armed, well-trained, and they know exactly where we are. Your best option is to— She cut him off with a gesture sharp and commanding. Sergeant Reeves, I need you to trust me. Keep your men with the patients and don't leave this wing of the facility no matter what you hear. Do you understand? Before Declan could respond, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow that turned the facility into something from a nightmare. In the distance, he could hear the systematic sound of weapons being checked and loaded, but it wasn't coming from his remaining team members. The sounds were too numerous, too professional, too organized. The patients need protection, DeBrickton said, checking a sidearm that had appeared from somewhere beneath her tactical vest. That's your mission now, Sergeant. As she moved toward the door, Declan caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Strapped to her right thigh was a knife he recognized immediately, a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife standard issue for British Special Forces. But it was the wear pattern on the handle, the way the blade showed signs of extensive use and careful maintenance that told the real story. This wasn't a showpiece or a borrowed weapon. This was a tool that had seen serious work. Doc, wait, Declan called out, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. What kind of medical facility is this? Dr. Brennan paused at the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the red emergency lighting. The kind that saves lives, Sergeant. Now rest. We'll talk when this is over. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkened corridors with a silence that would have impressed the best reconnaissance specialist Declan had ever worked with. He lay there in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of battle drawing closer, and for the first time in his military career, he felt completely out of his depth. Around him, the other patients lay in various stages of consciousness, completely dependent on the medical staff for their protection. They were a mix of local civilians and the wounded personnel from his team, all of them vulnerable, all of them trusting that someone would keep them safe. Declan's hand moved instinctively to where his sidearm should be, but found only bandages and medical tape. He was, for all practical purposes, defenseless. The gunfire outside intensified, and Declan could hear voices shouting in a language he didn't recognize. They were close now, maybe 50 meters from the main entrance. Then from somewhere deep in the facility came a sound that raised every hair on the back of his neck. It was the distinctive whistle of a flashbang grenade, followed by the sharp crack of its detonation. But the explosion had come from inside the building, not outside. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of backup generators and the soft beeping of medical equipment. The gunfire from outside had stopped completely, as if someone had simply flipped a switch. Declan strained to hear what was happening in the rest of the facility, but the architecture seemed designed to muffle sound, to compartmentalize and contain. There were footsteps in the corridors, but they moved with a careful precision that spoke of extensive tactical training. Occasionally he caught the sound of hushed voices speaking in what sounded like military jargon, but the words were too distant to make out clearly. Minutes passed like hours. Declan found himself counting his own heartbeats, a technique he'd learned during sniper training to stay calm under pressure. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for lying helpless while unknown forces moved through a building where he was supposed to be providing security. A sudden commotion in the corridor outside made Declan tense. The Portuguese nurse, João, he remembered, appeared in the doorway, half carrying a blood-soaked hostile fighter. Dr. Brennan, João called out urgently. Sucking chest wound, tension pneumothorax. He's got maybe 3 minutes. Through the open door, Declan heard Catherine's voice, cold and clinical. Bring him to Surgical 2. Sergeant Reeves, this is what we do. We don't let anyone die, even enemies. From his bed, Declan could see into the corridor as they rushed the wounded hostile past. Minutes later, he heard Catherine's voice over what sounded like a radio. Tango section, hold fire. I'm operating. South corridor is medical hot zone. A pause, then, needle decompression complete. Joao packed the entry wound while The sound of suppressed gunfire. A brief scuffle. Then Catherine's voice again, breathless, but steady. Chest tube insertion, proceeding. 3 hostiles neutralized outside Surgical 2. Resume perimeter defense. Declan stared at the ceiling, trying to process what he'd just heard. She was performing emergency surgery on an enemy combatant while coordinating a defensive battle, and apparently killing attackers in between surgical procedures. What kind of doctor was this? A soft knock at the door made it intense. The handle turned slowly, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was one of the nurses Declan had seen earlier helping to treat the wounded, a middle-aged man with graying hair and calm eyes. But like Dr. Brennan, his appearance had changed. The medical scrubs were gone, replaced by tactical gear that looked well used and perfectly fitted. Sergeant Reeves, the man said in accented English Portuguese. Declan thought Dr. Brennan asked me to check on you and the others. How are you feeling? I'm fine, Declan replied, studying the man's face for any clue about what was happening. What's the situation? The nurse smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. The situation is under control. Dr. Brennan is finishing up some administrative tasks, but she'll be back shortly to check on everyone. Administrative task. Declan had heard that euphemism before, usually in after-action debriefings, following operations that officially never happened. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, the nurse was gone, disappearing back into the darkened corridors with the same silent efficiency that seemed to characterize everyone in this facility. As the night wore on, Declan began to piece together fragments of information from the sounds filtering through the building. There were vehicles arriving and departing, but their engines were muffled in a way that suggested serious attention to noise discipline. He heard the distinctive sound of equipment being moved and stowed, and occasionally caught glimpses of figures moving past his window with a purposeful efficiency that marked professional operators rather than medical personnel. When Dr. Brennan finally returned, it was nearly dawn. She had changed back into medical scrubs, but Declan noticed immediately that she moved with a slight limp that hadn't been there before. Her hands, when she checked his IV lines, bore fresh scrapes across the knuckles, the kind of marks that came from close quarters fighting. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice back to the calm, professional tone he'd first heard. The British accent was still there, but softer now, less clipped. Declan studied her face in the growing light. There was a tiredness around her eyes that spoke of a long night's work, but also something else, a satisfaction, perhaps, of a job completed successfully. "I'm fine, Doc, but I have to ask, what exactly happened out there?" Dr. Brennan paused in her examination, meeting his gaze directly. Her eyes were gray. He noticed the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic. "Nothing happened, Sergeant. You and your team were brought to a medical facility after your helicopter crashed. We treated your injuries and kept you safe until extraction could be arranged. That's all that will appear in any official report." Declan nodded slowly, understanding the implicit message. "And the gunfire we heard, local wildlife can be quite aggressive in this region," Dr. Brennan replied without missing a beat, adjusting the flow rate on his IV. "Sometimes they need to be discouraged from approaching the facility too closely." As if on cue, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. Through the window, Declan could see dust clouds rising in the distance as his extraction team prepared to land. But his attention was drawn to something else, a line of covered forms being loaded into vehicles near what appeared to be a service entrance to the facility. Body bags. He counted them. 45. Dr. Brennan followed his gaze and nodded slightly. "The local wildlife," she said quietly. "They won't be a problem for future patients." A chill ran down Declan's spine as he began to understand exactly what kind of medical facility he'd stumbled into. And as the medical team prepared to transfer him to the extraction helicopters, he realized that his encounter with the mysterious Dr. Brennan was far from over. There were questions that needed answers, and the woman standing before him, this doctor who killed with the precision of a special forces operator and healed with the compassion of a trauma surgeon, represented something that challenged everything he thought he knew about modern warfare. Just before the extraction team carried him out, an older man appeared in the doorway. He had to be in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh environments. But it was his bearing that caught Declan's attention, the way he stood, the way he moved, the subtle signals that marked him as a lifetime military professional. He wore no uniform, no insignia, nothing that would identify him, but Declan recognized the posture immediately. Delta Force. The stance was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked with America's most elite counterterrorism unit. The older man nodded to Dr. Brennan. "Good work, Cat," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that suggested deep familiarity. "Your father would have been proud." Your Brennan's professional composure cracked for just a moment, and Declan saw something unexpected in her expression. Grief old and deep, mixed with a fierce determination. "Thank you, Colonel," she said softly. "I hope so." The older man, the colonel, turned his attention to Declan. "Take care of that leg, Sergeant, and remember what you saw here. Sometimes the best warriors are the ones who know when to heal." Then they were gone, both of them disappearing back into the facility as the extraction team loaded Declan onto a stretcher. As the helicopter lifted off, banking away from the facility, Declan caught one final glimpse of Dr. Brennan standing in the doorway. The older man, the colonel, stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of mentorship and deep affection. They watched the helicopter depart with the calm satisfaction of professionals who had just completed a successful mission. The last thing Declan noticed just before the facility disappeared from view was something through one of the windows, what looked like a wall covered in frames, though the distance made details impossible to discern. A memorial of some kind, perhaps. The image stayed with him as the helicopter banked away. As the helicopter gained altitude and turned south toward the extraction point, Declan looked down at his wrist. Someone, probably Dr. Brennan, had placed a medical bracelet on him during his unconsciousness. It was made of metal engraved with words he had to squint to read in the morning light. "Merc, those who fought now, protect." Below the words was a series of numbers that looked like coordinates, and a symbol he didn't recognize, a caduceus intertwined with a combat knife, forming a pattern that was both elegant and somehow threatening. Declan closed his eyes, trying to process everything he'd experienced in the past 12 hours. He'd been saved by a doctor who fought like a special forces operator. He'd witnessed what appeared to be a small medical staff successfully defending against a force of 45 hostiles without losing a single defender or patient. He'd seen body bags and emergency surgeries, professional military bearing, and civilian compassion, all wrapped together in a package that defied every category he'd been trained to recognize. And most disturbing of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. The efficiency, the training, the resources, all of it suggested an organization with reach and capability far beyond a single rural medical facility. Dr. Brennan and her colonel weren't improvising. They were executing a protocol following procedures that had been developed and refined over time. The pilot's voice crackled in his headset. "Sergeant Reeves, we've got a secure line to command. They want a preliminary report on the crash and your status." Declan opened his eyes and looked out at the Montana wilderness passing below. Thinking about Dr. Brennan's words, nothing happened. Just a medical facility providing care, helicopter crash. That's all that would appear in any official report. He keyed his microphone. "Tell them the crash site was secure. We received excellent medical care from a local facility. No hostile contact. All survivors stable for transport." It was a lie, of course. Or perhaps not quite a lie, more like a carefully crafted partial truth, the kind that would satisfy immediate questions while leaving deeper mysteries unexplored. Declan had the feeling that Dr. Brennan and her colonel had been counting on exactly this kind of report, that they'd calculated the probability of an injured SEAL keeping their secrets and found the odds acceptable. As the extraction helicopter crossed into friendly territory and Declan felt the tension in the crew begin to ease, he found his thoughts returning again and again to his brother Jake. Jake had died in a medical facility in Iraq 18 years ago. He'd been a Navy corpsman, a healer assigned to a Marine unit, and when insurgents overran their position, he'd stayed with the wounded rather than retreating to safety. They'd found him in the medical tent, lying across the body of a Marine he'd been trying to save, both of them killed by automatic weapons fire. Declan had joined the SEALs partly to honor Jake's memory, to ensure that healers like his brother would always have protection. But what he'd seen at Dr. Brennan's facility suggested a different approach entirely, not healers protected by warriors, but healers who were warriors themselves who could provide care and protection in equal measure. The question that haunted him as the helicopter carried him toward debriefing and recovery was simple. What if Jake had been like Dr. Brennan? What if he'd had the training, the skills, the capability to fight back? Would he still be alive today? Declan looked down at the medical bracelet again at those engraved coordinates. He didn't know where they led, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would find out. Dr. Brennan had saved his life, protected his team, and shown him something that challenged every assumption he'd built his career upon. He owed her answers at the very least. And perhaps, if he was honest with himself, he needed those answers for his own peace of mind. The helicopter began its descent toward the forward operating base, and Declan felt the familiar weight of military protocol settling back over him. There would be debriefings, medical evaluations, incident reports. There would be questions about the crash and the extraction, about what he'd seen and what he'd experienced. And through all of it, he would give them the truth they expected to hear while keeping the deeper truth to himself. Because some things Declan was beginning to understand operated outside the normal channels. Some missions were too important, too necessary to be constrained by official recognition or government oversight. Dr. Brennan and her colonel had built something remarkable in that Montana facility, a place where healing and protection weren't separate missions, but two sides of the same coin. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where his brother's memory lived, on Declan heard Jake's voice. Not the desperate radio call from that final day in Iraq, but something earlier. Something from before the war had taken him. Jake had always said that the best medicine was preventive care, that stopping harm before it happened was worth more than any treatment after the fact. Maybe that was what Dr. Brennan understood. Maybe that was what her facility represented. Not just healing the wounded, but preventing wounds in the first place. Not just treating trauma, but stopping trauma from occurring. It was a revolutionary concept, and if what he'd witnessed was any indication, it was working. The helicopter touched down with a gentle bump, and medical personnel rushed forward to assist with the transfer. As they loaded him onto a wheeled stretcher, Declan caught sight of his reflection in the helicopter's window. He looked like hell-exhausted, injured, bearing the marks of a mission gone wrong. But his eyes were clear, focused, alive, with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Dr. Catherine Brennan had saved his life. Now he needed to understand why and how and what it all meant. The medical bracelet on his wrist felt heavier than its actual weight, as if it carried not just coordinates but a promise, an invitation, a challenge. The last thing Declan saw before they wheeled him into the field hospital was the Montana sky, vast and blue and empty of threats. Somewhere out there, Dr. Brennan was probably already treating another patient, defending another facility, living out a mission that existed in the shadows between official military operations and civilian humanitarian work. And Declan knew with a certainty that surprised him with its intensity that he would see her again. The story that had begun with a helicopter crash in the Montana wilderness was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. 6 weeks after his evacuation from the Montana facility, Declan Reeves found himself sitting in a sterile conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia Beach. His leg had healed remarkably well, the compound fracture, knitting back together with a speed that had surprised his doctors. They attributed it to excellent initial treatment at the crash site, though none of them could explain exactly where that treatment had occurred. The official record showed only an abandoned building with minimal medical supplies, not the sophisticated trauma center Declan remembered. Across the table sat Commander Evelyn Ashford, a naval intelligence officer whose reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths was legendary throughout the special operations community. She was in her mid-50s with gray-streaked, auburn hair and pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed capable of reading the subtext beneath any statement. Declan had heard stories about her career, 30 years of intelligence work spanning Cold War operations, Desert Storm, and the global war on terror. If anyone could see through his carefully constructed after-action report, it would be her. "Tell me again about the medical staff," Commander Ashford said, her fingers moving across a tablet as she reviewed his statement for the third time. "Specifically their behavior during what you've described as a potential threat situation." Declan shifted in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "They were professional, ma'am, focused on patient care. They maintained operational security and ensured our safety until extraction could be arranged." Ashford looked up from her tablet, and Declan saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. It wasn't skepticism exactly, but rather a kind of knowing sadness, as if she'd heard this exact type of carefully worded evasion before and understood all too well what it concealed. Sergeant Reeves, she said, setting down the tablet and folding her hands on the table. We've analyzed satellite footage from that night. 45 enemy combatants approached the facility. By morning, all 45 were confirmed killed in action. Yet you're telling me that a handful of medical personnel somehow managed to repel a coordinated assault without suffering a single casualty. The number hit Declan like a physical blow. He'd estimated 40 based on what he'd seen and heard, but hearing the exact count 45 made the night's events even more impossible to explain within the bounds of conventional military action. 45 trained hostiles eliminated by what appeared on paper to be civilian medical staff. It was the kind of operational success that would be remarkable for a fully equipped Special Forces team, let alone doctors and nurses. Ma'am, Declan said carefully, I was injured and medicated. My observations may not have been entirely accurate. I can only report what I directly witnessed, which was medical personnel providing excellent care under difficult circumstances. Ashford leaned back in her chair, studying him with an intensity that made Declan feel like every thought in his head was visible on his face. Sergeant, I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've seen combat medics perform miracles under fire. I've seen Special Forces operators accomplish the impossible against overwhelming odds. But what happened at that facility defies explanation within normal operational parameters. She pulled up an image on her tablet and turned it so Declan could see. It was a satellite photograph showing thermal imaging overlays of the Montana facility during the attack. Declan could see the enemy forces arranged in what appeared to be a coordinated assault pattern, their thermal signatures bright against the cool Montana night. But as he watched the time-stamped sequence of images, those signatures disappeared one by one throughout the night in a pattern that suggested systematic elimination rather than conventional combat. The interesting thing, Ashford continued, her voice taking on a different quality, something almost confessional, is that we have no official record of this facility in our databases. According to every government source I can access, that building has been abandoned for over 3 years. Yet when we cross-reference medical supply shipments to the region, we found evidence of significant equipment deliveries over the past 18 months. Sophisticated trauma care equipment, surgical supplies, medications that would normally require DEA oversight. Declan remained silent, knowing that anything he said at this point would either be a long or a confirmation of secrets he'd been trusted to keep. Ashford seemed to sense his internal struggle because her expression softened slightly, taking on an almost sympathetic cast. There's something else you need to see, Oaka, she said, pulling up another file on her tablet. 3 days ago, a similar incident occurred at a refugee camp in Syria. Unknown medical personnel appeared seemingly from nowhere, provided emergency care to civilians caught in crossfire, and then disappeared before official aid organizations could make contact. Witnesses described one of the medical team leaders as a woman in her early 30s with a British accent and extraordinary surgical skills. The description sent a jolt through Declan's system. Dr. Brennan, it had to be. Ashford pulled up more files, each one documenting similar incidents. 2 weeks before that, a field hospital in Ukraine reported that their facility was saved from an artillery barrage by unknown personnel who neutralized the attacking force and then vanished. A month before your mission, a medical convoy in Somalia was ambushed by 26 hostiles. All the attackers were found dead the next morning, but the medical personnel and their patients were completely unharmed. She slid a stack of photographs across the table. Each showed similar scenes. Bodies of hostile forces arranged with the precision that marked professional military operations, medical facilities left intact and functional, and absolutely no trace of whoever had provided the protection. The pattern is consistent, Sergeant. Wherever this organization operates, impossible things happen. Medical facilities become impregnable fortresses. Civilians receive protection that would challenge the best military units. And then just as quickly as they appeared, these guardian angels disappear without a trace. Declan picked up one of the photographs, studying the tactical formations visible in the aftermath. The movement patterns were familiar, but not from any military training he'd received. They were more advanced, more refined than standard special operations doctrine, suggesting techniques that had been developed and perfected over years of real-world application. Ma'am, Declan said carefully, what exactly is Naval Intelligence's interest in what appears to be a civilian medical operation? Ashford's expression grew serious and she closed the tablet, leaning forward with her elbows on the table. That's classified above your current clearance level, Sergeant. But I can tell you this much, Dr. Catherine Brennan and her organization represent either the greatest humanitarian success story of the decade or a security concern that goes to the highest levels of national command authority. The use of Dr. Brennan's full name confirmed what Declan had already suspected. Naval Intelligence knew exactly who had saved his life that night in Montana. They'd been tracking her, building a file connecting incidents across multiple theaters of operation. The question was what they intended to do with that information. Ashford stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training facilities where the next generation of special operators were preparing for deployment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to a more personal tone, one that suggested this conversation had moved beyond official channels. Off the record, Sergeant, I need to know what you saw that night. Not what you think you should report, but what actually happened. Because if Dr. Brennan is who I think she might be, then you've encountered something that changes everything we thought we knew about modern warfare and humanitarian operations. Declan found himself at a crossroads. His training demanded that he stick to the official story, maintain operational security, and protect classified information. But his conscience and his growing sense that Dr. Brennan's work was too important to be compromised by government bureaucracy pushed him toward honesty. In the end, it was Ashford's reputation that made the decision for him. Everything he'd heard suggested she was a woman who valued truth over politics, who understood the sometimes necessary space between official policy and operational reality. Ma'am, Declan began, his voice steady. I believe Dr. Brennan and her team are military professionals operating under medical cover for humanitarian missions. They're highly trained, probably with special forces backgrounds, and they've created an organization capable of providing medical care in the world's most dangerous places while simultaneously defending that care against hostile forces. Ashford nodded slowly, as if his assessment confirmed suspicions she'd already formed. There's something else you need to know, Sergeant. We've been tracking financial patterns related to these incidents. Someone is funding these operations on a massive scale. The equipment alone, military-grade medical facilities, logistics, support personnel costs. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And the funding sources are so well hidden that even our best forensic accountants can't trace them. She returned to the table and pulled up another file, this one showing financial transaction patterns that resembled a spider web of connections across multiple countries and currencies. Declan studied the charts, trying to make sense of the complex flow of money, but it was clearly beyond his expertise. Whoever is backing Dr. Brennan has resources that rival most government intelligence budgets. Ashford continued, they've created a network that can appear anywhere in the world on short notice, equipped with military-grade medical facilities and staffed by personnel whose training exceeds most special operations units. The question is whether this organization represents an opportunity or a threat to national security. She fixed Declan with a steady gaze. Which brings me to why you're really here, Sergeant. We want you to find her. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Declan had spent the past 6 weeks trying to convince himself that his encounter with Dr. Brennan was a one-time event, an anomaly brought about by the circumstances of the helicopter crash. But deep down, he'd known this moment was coming, the moment when he would have to choose between following orders and honoring the debt he owed to the woman who had saved his life. Ma'am, Declan said carefully, with respect, Dr. Brennan saved my life and the lives of my team members. Whatever else she might be, she's not an enemy. Ashford's expression softened. I'm not suggesting she's an enemy, Sergeant, but we need to understand what we're dealing with. An organization with this level of capability operating outside normal command structures represents questions that need answers, even if those answers are ultimately reassuring. She slid a document across the table, a temporary duty assignment order, assigning Declan to a joint task force investigating unconventional humanitarian operations. The classification level was higher than anything he'd worked with before, suggesting resources and authority far beyond normal military channels. Your mission is to make contact with Dr. Brennan and her organization, Ashford explained, Determine their capabilities, their intentions, and whether they represent a potential ally or a security concern that needs to be addressed. You'll be working with a team of analysts and field operatives, but you're the only person we know of who's had direct contact with Dr. Brennan and survived to tell about it. Declan picked up his orders, scanning through the dense legal language that essentially gave him carte blanche to pursue the investigation wherever it led. At the bottom of the document was a handwritten note in what appeared to be Ashford's precise script: "Find the truth, but remember that truth is sometimes more important than policy." "And if I refuse?" Declan asked, though he already knew the answer. Ashford's expression grew stern. "Then you'll return to your unit and never speak of this again. But you'll also know that questions about Dr. Brennan and her organization will remain unanswered, and the next time they appear somewhere in the world, we'll be just as unprepared as we were 6 weeks ago." As Declan left the conference room, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd learned. Dr. Brennan wasn't just a doctor who happened to have military training. She was the leader of an organization that operated at the intersection of medical aid and tactical operations, funded by mysterious sources and staffed by personnel whose capabilities exceeded most government units. The question that haunted him as he prepared for his new assignment was whether he was being asked to find an ally or to neutralize a threat. The investigation began immediately. Declan was assigned to a small team of intelligence analysts who had been quietly tracking Dr. Brennan's organization for the better part of a year. They had files, photographs, financial records, all pieces of a puzzle that suggested an operation far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. The first lead took Declan to Geneva, where a series of shell companies had been registered to handle medical equipment purchases. The trail was deliberately obscured, layered with legal entities and financial instruments designed to prevent exactly the kind of investigation Declan was conducting. But his team was good, and slowly, methodically, they began to peel back the layers. 3 weeks into the investigation, spanning 4 countries and countless dead ends, Declan found himself standing outside what appeared to be a small medical clinic in Geneva's financial district. It was his team's most promising lead yet, though he suspected Dr. Brennan had left the breadcrumbs deliberately. The receptionist who greeted him was a middle-aged woman whose pleasant smile didn't quite hide the fact that her eyes were constantly assessing him for potential threats. "Mr. Reeves," she said, using the civilian cover name his team had established, "we've been expecting you. Dr. Brennan will see you shortly." The use of his name, even the false one, sent a chill down Declan's spine. He had made the appointment under carefully constructed documentation that should have been impossible to penetrate. Yet somehow Dr. Brennan's organization had seen through his cover before he'd even walked through the door. As he waited in the reception area, Declan observed the other patients. They appeared to be a mix of international travelers and business people, but he noticed that several bore the subtle markers of military service. The particular way they sat, the way their eyes tracked movement, the unconscious positioning that suggested combat training. Whatever this clinic was treating, it wasn't just ordinary travel-related illnesses. "Mr. Reeves," the familiar voice made him look up. Brennan stood in the doorway wearing a white coat over the professional clothing. She looked exactly as he remembered, though her expression carried a mixture of amusement and something that might have been resignation. "To Brennan," Declan replied, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, but he noticed that she held his hand just a moment longer than necessary, her thumb finding and pressing against a specific pressure point on his wrist. It was a technique used to detect concealed recording devices, and her slight nod told him that she'd found exactly what she was looking for. "Please come to my office," she said. "We have much to discuss." Her office was larger than Declan had expected, with medical diplomas and certificates covering one wall. But his trained eye caught other details: a computer system that looked far more sophisticated than anything needed for a small clinic, communication equipment that suggested global connectivity, and a safe built into the wall that was designed to military specifications. "You've been looking for me for quite some time," Dr. Brennan said, settling behind her desk. 3 weeks, multiple countries, and considerable resources expended. "I'm flattered by the attention, Sergeant Reeves. Or should I say Staff Sergeant? Your cover documentation is excellent, but not quite perfect." Declan felt his carefully prepared approach crumble in the face of her directness. "How long have you known I was looking for you?" De Brennan smiled, and for the first time Declan saw warmth in her expression, not the professional courtesy of their first meeting, but genuine amusement. Since the day you left my facility in Montana, did you really think that someone with my resources wouldn't monitor the people whose lives we've touched? I've been tracking your investigation since it began, Sergeant. Every meeting with Commander Ashford, every surveillance operation, every financial trace. I know exactly why you're here. She opened a file on her desk and slid it across to him. Inside were photographs documenting every step of his investigation meetings with Ashford surveillance operations, outside suspected Merck facilities, financial transactions related to his cover identity. The level of detail was staggering and suggested an intelligence capability that rivaled major government agencies. The question isn't how long I've known you were looking for me, Dr. Brennan continued. The question is why I'm allowing you to find me now. Declan studied the photographs, realizing with a growing sense of unease that her organization had been watching his investigation from the very beginning. Every move he'd made, every lead he'd followed, had been monitored and documented with professional precision. He'd thought he was hunting her, but in reality, she'd been watching him the entire time. "Why did I come?" he asked simply. Dr. Brennan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling streets of Geneva. The afternoon light caught her profile, and for the first time Declan noticed the weight she carried, not physical weight, but the burden of responsibility that marked anyone who'd spent years making life and death decisions. Because the world is changing, Sergeant. The old models of conflict resolution aren't working anymore. Traditional military solutions create more refugees than they protect. Humanitarian aid without security capability leaves civilians defenseless. What my organization represents is something new, something that's desperately needed, but that also challenges every conventional understanding of how humanitarian operations should work. She turned back to face him, and Declan could see the passion and conviction that drove her work. "We call ourselves the Medical Emergency Response Corps, though that name appears in no government database and no official records. We are physicians, nurses, medics, and tactical specialists who have dedicated our lives to providing medical care in the world's most dangerous places. Not despite the danger, Sergeant, but because of it. Because someone has to stand between the healers and those who would harm them." She moved to a wall where a large map showed locations around the globe marked with colored pins. Declan recognized several of them as sites where impossible medical miracles had been reported, places where civilian medical personnel had somehow managed to provide care under combat conditions that should have made treatment impossible. "We have 147 active personnel worldwide," Dr. Brennan continued. "Former Special Forces operators who became medical professionals, doctors and nurses who received tactical training, medics who wanted to do more than just treat the symptoms of conflict. Every single person in my organization is dual qualified, capable of providing emergency medical care at the highest level, while also defending themselves and their patients against hostile forces." Declan studied the map, beginning to understand the true scope of what Dr. Brennan had built. This wasn't just a single facility in Montana or a small team of combat medics. This was a global network with resources, training, and capabilities that exceeded most government humanitarian organizations. "Who funds you?" he asked. Dr. Brennan's smile was enigmatic. "People who believe that healing and protecting are not mutually exclusive missions. Individuals who have the resources to support an organization that operates outside traditional bureaucratic constraints. I won't give you names, Sergeant, but I can tell you that every dollar we receive comes from people who have lost someone, a doctor, a nurse, a medic who died because they couldn't defend themselves." She returned to her desk and pulled out another file, this one much thicker than the first. "I'm going to tell you something that your government doesn't know and that your investigation hasn't uncovered. We've been approached by several intelligence agencies offering contracts for our services. The CIA wants us to provide medical cover for covert operations. Russian intelligence has offered us funding in exchange for information on American activities. Chinese military intelligence believes we could be useful for expanding their influence in developing nations." The implications hit Declan immediately. An organization with Dr. Brennan's capabilities could be an incredible asset for any intelligence agency, but it could also represent a massive security threat if it fell under the wrong influence. The fact that multiple governments were trying to recruit her organization suggested that Merck's existence and capabilities were more widely known than Ashford had indicated. What did you tell them? Declan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Derbrennan's expression grew serious. We told them what I'm going to tell your Navy and your intelligence services. We work for the patients. Period. We don't take government contracts. We don't gather intelligence for foreign powers. And we don't allow political considerations to influence our medical decisions. The moment we become an arm of any government's foreign policy, we lose the neutrality that allows us to operate in conflict zones. We become targets instead of caregivers, combatants instead of healers. She opened the thick file and spread its contents across the desk. Inside were medical records, mission reports, financial statements, and organizational documents that detailed her organization with meticulous precision. Declan realized that she was giving him access to information that intelligence agencies had spent millions trying to obtain. This is everything, Dr. Brennan said. Our organizational structure, our funding sources, our operational procedures, our mission statements. I'm giving this to you because I believe that transparency is the only way to prevent misunderstanding. Commander Ashford wants to know if we're a threat or an ally. This documentation should help her make that determination. Declan began reading through the documents, his amazement growing with each page. The organization was even more sophisticated than his investigation had suggested. They maintained medical facilities on 4 continents, operated a logistics network that could deploy anywhere in the world within 72 hours, and had treated over 3,000 patients in active conflict zones without losing a single team member. But there was something else in the documents that caught his attention: casualty reports from Merc operations. Not their own casualties, but those of hostile forces they'd engaged. The numbers were staggering. Over 300 enemy combatants killed across multiple operations, all in defense of medical facilities or humanitarian missions. You carry these deaths with you, Declan said, remembering the wall of photographs he'd glimpsed in her Montana facility. Dr. Brennan's expression grew pained. Every single one. I know their names when we can identify them. I pray for them. I ask forgiveness for each life taken. But I do it again, Sergeant, because the alternative, allowing healers to die defenseless, is something I cannot accept. Before Declan could respond, Dr. Brennan pulled out one final document. This one was marked with classifications he'd never seen before, suggesting intelligence sources far beyond what a civilian organization should have access to. There's something else your government needs to understand, she said, her voice taking on an urgent quality. Multiple government agencies are developing programs to weaponize medical aid using humanitarian missions as cover for military operations, leveraging medical access to gather intelligence, compromising the neutrality that allows aid organizations to operate in conflict zones. If this continues, if medical aid becomes associated with intelligence operations, it will destroy the trust that allows any humanitarian work to happen. Declan felt a chill as he read through the document. The implications were staggering. If governments began systematically using medical missions as cover for intelligence gathering or military operations, it would compromise every legitimate humanitarian organization in the world. Medical personnel would become targets. Aid organizations would be denied access to conflict zones. Civilians who desperately needed care would suffer. We won't allow that to happen, Dr. Brennan said firmly. Medical neutrality must be preserved, or civilians will lose access to care in the places where they need it most. We've taken steps to ensure that any attempt to compromise medical neutrality will be, she paused, choosing her words carefully, actively discouraged. The way she said discouraged reminded Declan forcefully of the 45 enemy combatants who had approached her facility that night in Montana. Her organization wasn't just capable of providing medical care under fire, they were prepared to actively defend the principle of medical neutrality against anyone who threatened it. What do you want from me? Declan asked. Brennan collected the documents and placed them in a secure case, which she handed to him. I want you to take this information back to Commander Ashford. I want your government to understand that we exist, that we're not going away, and that we're willing to cooperate with legitimate interests as long as they respect our core principles. We're not hiding anymore, Sergeant. But we're also not compromising our mission. She stood and moved toward the door, then paused. There's one more thing. I told you that we've been approached by various intelligence agencies. What I didn't mention is that we've also been monitoring several emerging crisis situations where civilian populations are at risk. Traditional military responses won't work in these situations, and conventional humanitarian aid can't operate safely. We could use someone with your background and training, someone who understands both military operations and the importance of protecting civilians. The offer hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Dr. Brennan was offering him a place in her organization, a chance to be part of something that operated outside traditional channels, but that might be more important than any official mission. Tell Commander Ashford that she can reach me through the same channels you used to arrange this appointment, Dr. Brennan said, opening the door. We're not hiding anymore, Sergeant, but we're also not compromising our principles. Not for the CIA, not for Russian intelligence, not for Chinese military interests, and not for your Navy. We serve the patients. That's our only loyalty to you. As Declan prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Brennan walked him to the front entrance. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Geneva, casting long shadows across the streets. One final question, Declan said, turning back to face her. That night in Montana when your facility was attacked, how many of your people were actually medical personnel? Brennan's smile was both sad and proud. All of them, Sergeant. Every single person you encountered that night was a fully qualified medical professional. They just happened to also be some of the most highly trained tactical specialists in the world. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us necessary. As Declan walked away from the clinic, the secure case containing Dr. Brennan's files felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He had found the answers that Commander Ashford wanted, but those answers raised questions that went to the heart of modern warfare and humanitarian operations. Dr. Brennan's organization represented something entirely new, a fusion of medical care and tactical capability that could revolutionize how the world responded to humanitarian crises. But it also represented a challenge to traditional government control over both military and medical operations. The question that haunted Declan as he prepared his report wasn't whether Merck was a threat or an ally. It was whether the world was ready for what Dr. Brennan had created, an organization that refused to accept that healing and protecting had to be separate missions, that insisted medical neutrality was worth fighting for, and that had the capability to back up that conviction with lethal force when necessary. As he boarded his flight back to the United States, Declan found his thoughts returning to his brother Jake, to that medical facility in Iraq where healers had died defenseless. Dr. Brennan had built something that ensured that tragedy would never happen again, at least not to anyone under her protection. The question was whether governments would see that as progress or as threat. And as the plane lifted off, carrying him toward debriefing and decisions that would shape the future of Mercer's relationship with the United States government, Declan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed something historic, the birth of a new kind of organization that might change the fundamental nature of humanitarian work in conflict zones. The war Dr. Brennan was fighting wasn't against any particular enemy. It was against the idea that civilians had to choose between medical care and security, that healers had to be helpless, that protecting the vulnerable required accepting their vulnerability. And as Declan considered her offer to join that fight, he realized that everything he'd believed about military service and humanitarian work was being challenged in ways he was only beginning to understand. 48 hours after his meeting with Dr. Brennan in Geneva, Declan Reeves found himself back in the sterile conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command, the secure case containing Mercy's complete operational documentation sitting on the table between him and Commander Ashford. The weight of what he carried, not just the physical files, but the implications they represented, had made the flight back to Virginia feel interminable. Commander Ashford had spent the past 3 hours reviewing the documents with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Declan watched as emotions flickered across her face: surprise, admiration, concern, and something else he couldn't quite identify. When she finally looked up from the last page, her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from exhaustion or emotion he couldn't tell. "My God," she said softly, setting down the final document with hands that trembled slightly. She documented everything, every mission we failed at, every civilian we couldn't protect, every doctor or nurse who died because we didn't think medical personnel needed armed protection. Ashford stood and walked to the window, her posture suggesting the weight of decades of intelligence work suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. "There's something I need to tell you, Sergeant, something that's not in any official file. In 1991, I was a junior intelligence officer assigned to Desert Storm. One of my responsibilities was assessing security threats to military medical facilities in the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations. She pulled out a photograph from her briefcase, old, slightly faded, showing a young Army doctor in desert camouflage standing beside a field hospital tent. The man in the photo had an open, honest face and wore the insignia of a trauma surgeon. Dr. Michael Brennan, Ashford continued, her voice thick with emotion. Catherine's father. I cleared his hospital as a safe zone, told him no additional security was necessary, that our air superiority and forward positions made his location secure. 3 days later, Iraqi forces that we hadn't properly accounted for overran his position. He stayed with his patients, tried to defend them with nothing but a scalpel and his Hippocratic oath. By the time reinforcements arrived, he was dead along with 6 other medical personnel. Declan felt the pieces clicking into place. Dr. Brennan's drive, her absolute commitment to protecting medical personnel, her refusal to let healers remain defenseless. It all stemmed from a tragedy that Ashford had been part of, however inadvertently. Catherine was 1 year old when her father died, Ashford said, still staring out the window. She never knew him except through stories and service records, but she spent her entire life trying to finish what he started, trying to prove that healers don't have to choose between their mission and their survival. And I spent 33 years carrying the guilt of sending a good man to his death because I made a bad call. She turned back to face Declan, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. She included a letter in these documents, for me specifically. She wrote that her father wouldn't blame me for what happened, and neither does she. After all these years, she's offering me forgiveness I never thought I deserved. Before Declan could respond, the conference room door opened without warning. A man in his late 50s entered wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of senior military leadership. His face was hard, his eyes calculating, and something about his presence immediately set Declan's instincts on edge. "Commander Ashford," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that expected immediate compliance. "I'm Deputy Director Harrison Caldwell, CIA Special Activities Center. I need to see those documents immediately." Ashford's expression shifted from grief to professional wariness in an instant. "Director Caldwell, this is a naval intelligence investigation. I'm not authorized to share classified materials with—" Commander, the Caldwell interrupted, pulling out credentials that suggested authority far above Ashford's pay grade. "Those documents contain information about an organization that has been designated a priority intelligence target by multiple agencies. Staff Sergeant Reeves conducted this investigation under false pretenses, and his unauthorized contact with a foreign operator constitutes a breach of national security protocols. He's under arrest effective immediately." Declan felt his world tilting. He'd known there were risks involved in his mission, but the idea that his authorized investigation could suddenly be reframed as a crime suggested political maneuvering at levels far above his understanding. "Sir," Ashford protested, "Sergeant Reeves was operating under orders I personally authorized. He was orders you lacked the authority to give." Caldwell cut her off. "The jurisdiction for this investigation was transferred to CIA oversight 3 weeks ago. You should have been notified, but apparently there was an administrative delay. Regardless, Staff Sergeant Reeves is now in my custody." 2 men in plain clothes entered the room, moving with the economical efficiency of professional security personnel. They positioned themselves on either side of Declan, not touching him yet, but making their intentions clear. Declan's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening and why Dr. Brennan's decision to provide full transparency had suddenly triggered this aggressive response. Caldwell picked up the secure case containing Mercer's documentation, scanning through the contents with an expression that suggested he already knew what they contained. Dr. Catherine Brennan and her Medical Emergency Response Corps represent exactly the kind of asset that America needs in the current geopolitical climate. Highly trained operators with medical expertise, global reach, and the ability to operate in denied territories without official cover. The problem is she's wasting those capabilities on actual humanitarian work when they could be serving our national interests. The casual way Caldwell dismissed Merca's humanitarian mission as a waste sent a chill down Declan's spine. This wasn't about security concerns or proper oversight. This was about control, about powerful interests wanting to acquire Dr. Brennan's organization and repurpose it for operations that had nothing to do with protecting medical personnel. Director Ashford said, her voice carefully controlled. These files show that Merck has saved over 3,000 lives in conflict zones. They've maintained perfect medical neutrality and haven't compromised American interests in any way. On what grounds are you designating them as a threat? Caldwell's smile was cold. They operate outside American authority, Commander. That alone makes them a concern. But more importantly, Dr. Brennan has repeatedly refused to cooperate with legitimate intelligence operations. We offered her a contract, generous terms, significant funding, complete operational autonomy, as long as she provided intelligence support when requested. She declined. That kind of refusal suggests either poor judgment or potentially hostile intent. Declan watched Ashford's face as she processed this information, saw the moment when understanding clicked into place. You don't want to assess Merck as a threat or an ally, she said slowly. You want to force them to work for you. And if they won't cooperate voluntarily, you'll designate them as hostile and either absorb their personnel or eliminate the organization entirely. I want to ensure that American resources, and make no mistake, any organization with Merck's capabilities operating in our sphere of influence is a resource serve American interests, Caldwell corrected. Doctor, Brennan's father died serving his country. It's time his daughter did the same, even if she needs persuading to see the patriotic duty in what we're offering. The casual invocation of Dr. Brennan's father, the suggestion that forcing her organization into intelligence work somehow honored his sacrifice, made Declan's blood boil. He thought of the wall of photographs in her Montana facility, the 300 faces of people she'd killed to protect her patients, the weight of responsibility she carried for every life, taken in defense of medical neutrality. Sir, Declan said, keeping his voice level with effort, with respect, Dr. Brennan's organization exists to protect medical personnel. If you force them into intelligence operations, you compromise the neutrality that allows them to operate in conflict zones. You turn them from protectors into targets. Caldwell's attention snapped to Declan with predatory focus. Sergeant, you spent 6 weeks in Dr. Brennan's facility. You witnessed their capabilities firsthand. Tell me, don't you think those skills would be better used serving American interests rather than providing charity to people who probably can't even spell democracy? The contempt in Caldwell's voice, the dismissive characterization of Merck's humanitarian work as mere charity, crystallized everything Declan had been feeling since Geneva into sharp clarity. This wasn't about national security or proper oversight. This was about powerful men who saw Dr. Brennan's organization as a tool to be exploited rather than a mission to be respected. No, sir, Declan said firmly. I think Dr. Brennan is doing exactly what needs to be done. My brother died in a medical facility in Iraq because he couldn't defend himself while treating patients. Dr. Brennan ensures that never happens to anyone under her protection. That's not charity, that's evolution in how we approach humanitarian operations. Your brother's death was tragic, Caldwell said dismissively, but irrelevant to current operational requirements. You're under arrest, Sergeant. These men will escort you to a secure facility where we'll continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting. As the security personnel moved to take Declan into custody, Ashford made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and initiated a call, her fingers moving with practiced speed across the screen. Director Caldwell, she said, her voice carrying a new authority. I'm placing a call to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. Your arrest of Staff Sergeant Reeves is not only unauthorized, but represents obstruction of an ongoing naval intelligence investigation. Furthermore, your stated intention to coerce a civilian organization into intelligence operations without presidential authorization constitutes a violation of multiple statutory restrictions on CIA domestic operations. Caldwell's expression darkened. Commander, you're making a serious mistake. Stand down or I'll ensure your career ends today. My career is less important than preventing an illegal operation that could compromise American credibility in humanitarian operations worldwide, Ashford replied calmly. And for the record, Director, this conversation has been recorded and transmitted to multiple oversight authorities. Your threat to my career is now part of an official record. The room fell into tense silence as Caldwell processed this new reality. His security personnel looked uncertain, caught between conflicting chains of command. Declan remained still, watching the confrontation play out with a growing sense that this moment would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Merck's relationship with the United States government. Ashford's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and allowed herself a small smile. That's confirmation from the Inspector General's office. They're dispatching a team to take custody of these documents and to ensure that Staff Sergeant Reeves remains in proper naval custody while this matter is investigated. Director Caldwell, you're being placed under investigation for unauthorized operations planning and attempted coercion of foreign nationals. Caldwell's face went through several shades of red before settling on a kind of controlled fury. This isn't over, Commander. There are interests at work here that you don't understand. Brennan's organization represents a capability that's too important to be left in independent hands. One way or another, Merck will serve American purposes. No, a new voice said from the doorway, we won't. Everyone turned to see Dr. Catherine Brennan standing in the entrance to the conference room, accompanied by an older man in his late 60s who moved with the unmistakable bearing of a lifetime military professional. Declan recognized him immediately, the colonel from the Montana facility, the man who had called Dr. Brennan Cat, with fatherly affection. How did you? Ashford began, then stopped, realizing the question was unnecessary. Of course, Dr. Brennan had been monitoring the situation. Her intelligence capabilities rivaled any government agency. Dr. Brennan stepped into the room, her presence commanding despite her civilian clothes. Director Caldwell, you made the same mistake many people make about Merck. You assume that because we operate outside official channels, we're vulnerable to coercion or control. But you failed to understand what we actually are: not an organization that wants government or protection or funding, but one that explicitly rejects government entanglement precisely to maintain our independence and neutrality. The older man, the colonel, moved to stand beside Dr. Brennan, and Declan saw protectiveness in his posture that went beyond professional concern. This was personal for him in ways that suggested deep emotional investment. Director, the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military command. I'm Colonel Thaddeus Granger, retired Delta Force. I served with Catherine's father in Desert Storm, and I've spent the last 15 years helping her build Merck into what it is today. Before you threaten this organization further, you should understand something fundamental. Every single person in Merck is there by choice, drawn by a mission they believe in more than any government paycheck or official recognition. Caldwell recovered his composure quickly. Colonel Granger, your service record is impressive, but it doesn't give you or Dr. Brennan the authority to operate a paramilitary organization on American soil. Mercy's Montana facility alone represents violations of numerous federal statutes regarding private armies and unlicensed medical facilities. Then arrest us, Dr. Brennan said calmly. Take us into custody, prosecute us publicly, and explain to the American people why you're shutting down an organization that has saved 3,000 lives without losing a single operator or compromising a single intelligence operation. Explain why the CIA is more interested in controlling humanitarian operations than allowing them to function independently. She moved closer to the table, her gray eyes fixed on Caldwell with an intensity that made even the experienced CIA director shift uncomfortably. Or better yet, explain to Congress why you attempted to coerce a civilian organization into intelligence operations without proper authorization, why you arrested a decorated SEAL for conducting an authorized investigation, and why you threatened a naval intelligence officer for refusing to participate in your unauthorized operation. Caldwell's expression suggested he was recalculating his approach. Dr. Brennan, you are misunderstanding our intentions. We simply want to establish a cooperative relationship that benefits both your organization and American national interests. By threatening arrest, enforcing cooperation, Dr. Brennan's voice carried a sharp edge. Director, I've received similar offers from Russian intelligence, Chinese military intelligence, and half a dozen other agencies who see Merck as a tool to be exploited. I rejected them all for the same reason I'm rejecting you. The moment we become an arm of any government's foreign policy, we lose the neutrality that allows us to operate in conflict zones. We become combatants instead of caregivers, targets instead of protectors. Colonel Granger pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, and Declan noticed for the first time how pale he looked, how labored his breathing seemed. Dr. Brennan noticed too, her professional concern momentarily overriding the confrontation as she moved to check on him. I'm fine, Kat. Granger said, waving her away gently. Just tired. But we need to finish this conversation. He turned his attention to Caldwell. Director, I don't have much time left. Heart condition, terminal 6 months at most. I'm spending what's left of my life ensuring that Mierk survives after I'm gone, that Catherine's mission continues, that her father's legacy lives on. You want to threaten that? You want to compromise everything we've built? Then you'll have to go through me first, and I promise you, I still have enough fight left to make it very unpleasant. The room fell silent as everyone processed this revelation. Declan saw the pain flash across Dr. Brennan's face, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. The Colonel Granger wasn't just her mentor and organizational co-founder. He was the closest thing to a father she'd ever known, and he was dying. Ashford's phone buzzed again, and this time her expression showed relief. The Inspector General's team has arrived. Director Caldwell, you're being escorted out while this matter is investigated. Dr. Brennan, Colonel Granger, you're both requested to provide testimony regarding Merck's operations and your interactions with various intelligence agencies. As federal agents entered the room to take charge of the situation, Dr. Brennan moved to Colonel Granger's side. Declan watched as she helped him stand, her professional medical expertise evident in how she assessed his condition with subtle observations. The older man leaned on her slightly, and Declan saw in that simple gesture the depth of their relationship: surrogate, father and daughter, mentor, and protege, two people bound by shared mission and mutual devotion. Commander Ashford, Dr. Brennan said, I meant what I wrote into my letter. My father wouldn't blame you for what happened in 1991, and neither do I. You made the best assessment you could with the information available. But his death and the deaths of hundreds of other medical personnel taught us a lesson that can't be ignored. Healers need protection, and sometimes that protection has to come from within, rather than being provided by others. The next several hours passed in a blur of testimony, documentation review, and careful diplomatic maneuvering. Dr. Brennan and Colonel Granger provided detailed accounts of Mercy's formation operations and careful maintenance of political neutrality. They explained their funding sources: anonymous donors who had lost family members in medical-related casualties, veteran groups who understood the need for protected humanitarian operations, and private foundations that believed in Mercy's mission. Throughout it all, Declan watched Colonel Granger's condition gradually worsen. The older man tried to hide it, but decades of military discipline couldn't completely mask the pain he was experiencing. Dr. Brennan noticed too her professional concern, warring with her need to complete the testimony that might determine Merck's future. It was late evening when the Inspector General's team finally concluded their initial investigation. Director Caldwell had been placed on administrative leave pending a full inquiry into his unauthorized operation planning. The documents Dr. Brennan had provided were being reviewed by multiple oversight committees to determine how Merck should be classified as a threat and ally, or something entirely new that didn't fit existing categories. As people began filing out of the conference room, Ashford approached Dr. Brennan and Colonel Granger. There's going to be a congressional hearing, she said quietly. Armed Services Committee probably within 6 weeks. They'll want testimony about Mercy's operations, your capabilities, your intentions. I can't promise what the outcome will be, but I can tell you that your transparency today has bought you something that coercion never could. Time and consideration. Dr. Brennan nodded, her attention divided between Ashford's words and Colonel Granger's deteriorating condition. Thank you, Commander, for everything, but especially for the letter you included in your intelligence assessment. Knowing that you've carried guilt for my father's death in all these years, that must have been unbearable. Not as unbearable as knowing I sent a good man to his death, Ashford replied. But your forgiveness means more than you can imagine. Your father was a remarkable person, Catherine. He talked about you constantly, showed everyone pictures of his baby daughter, made plans for all the things he'd teach you when you were old enough. He would be so incredibly proud of what you've become. The emotion that flickered across Dr. Brennan's face, grief for the father she'd never known, gratitude for words she'd waited her entire life to hear, was almost too intimate to witness. Declan found himself looking away, giving her a moment of privacy for feelings that ran deeper than any professional concern. Colonel Granger needs medical attention, Dr. Brennan said, her voice steadying as she shifted back into physician mode. May I take him back to our facility? Ashford nodded. You're not under arrest or restriction, but Catherine, be careful. Caldwell isn't the only person who sees Merck as a tool to be exploited. There are interests at work here that won't give up just because one operation was disrupted. As Dr. Brennan helped Colonel Granger toward the exit, the older man turned back to Declan. Sergeant Reeves walked with us for a moment. They made their way slowly to a private vehicle waiting outside the command building. The Montana night had given way to Virginia humidity, but the darkness felt similar, full of unseen watchers and unresolved tensions. Once they were outside the building's surveillance range, Colonel Granger spoke again. "Declan," he said, using the familiar name for the first time. "I told you in Montana that sometimes the best warriors are the ones who know when to heal. I'm dying, and I won't see Merck's story through to the end. But Catherine will. She's stronger than her father, smarter than me, and more committed to this mission than anyone I have ever known. When the congressional hearing happens, when powerful people try to compromise what we've built, Merck will need allies who understand what we're actually trying to accomplish." "Sir," Declan began, but Granger waved him off. "You joined the SEALs because your brother died in a medical facility that couldn't defend itself. Catherine built Merck because her father died the same way. You understand this mission in your bones, son. The question is whether you're willing to fight for it when fighting might mean going against the very institutions you've served your entire career." Dr. Brennan helped Granger into the vehicle, then turned to face Declan. In the dim light from the parking lot, her expression was unreadable, but her voice carried a weight that suggested this moment was more important than the casual conversation implied. "The offer I made in Geneva stands, Sergeant. MEAR needs people who understand both military operations and humanitarian missions, who can bridge the gap between what governments want and what civilians need. But more than that, we need people who believe in what we're doing, not just with their minds, but with their hearts. People like you who've lost someone because healers couldn't protect themselves." She handed him a card with nothing but a phone number embossed in simple black text. "Think about it. If you decide you want to be part of finishing what your brother started, what my father started, what Colonel Granger has devoted his final years to building, call that number. But only if you're absolutely certain, because once you commit to this mission, there's no halfway. You're either all in or you're out entirely." As the vehicle pulled away carrying Dr. Brennan and the dying Colonel Granger back toward whatever secure location Mercy maintained in the area, Declan stood in the parking lot holding a simple business card that represented a choice he'd never expected to face. His entire adult life had been about service within established institutions, the Navy Special Operations, the chain of command that gave structure and meaning to military life. But Brennan and Colonel Granger had shown him something different, a way of serving that existed outside those structures, that operated according to principles rather than orders, that measured success not by missions accomplished, but by lives saved and healers protected. The next 6 weeks passed with excruciating slowness. Declan returned to his SEAL team but found himself increasingly disconnected from the routines that had once defined his existence. He went through the motions of training and preparation, but his mind kept returning to Montana, to Geneva, to the choice that Dr. Brennan had laid before him. The congressional hearing, when it finally arrived, became a media sensation. News outlets covered it extensively, drawn by the dramatic story of a secret organization that combined military precision with humanitarian missions, ORMO. Brennan testified for 7 hours, showing footage of Merck operations, explaining their protocols for maintaining medical neutrality, and making an impassioned case for why healers needed the ability to protect themselves. Declan watched the hearing from his barracks along with most of his SEAL team. The footage Dr. Brennan showed was carefully edited to protect operational security, but it was powerful nonetheless. Medical personnel treating civilians under fire, tactical operations conducted with precision to eliminate threats while minimizing casualties, and most movingly, testimony from patients whose lives had been saved by Merck's unique combination of medical expertise and protective capability. But the moment that silenced the entire hearing room came when Dr. Brennan played audio from 1991, her father's final radio transmission, before Iraqi forces overran his medical facility. Michael Brennan's voice calm, despite the circumstances, saying he wouldn't abandon his patients, that he would stay and defend them for as long as he could, that someone needed to protect the healers. "That was my father's last message." Dr. Brennan said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was 1 year old when he died. I never knew him except through recordings like this, through stories from people who served with him, through the legacy he left behind. Merck exists because I spent my entire life wondering what would have happened if my father had been able to defend himself, if he'd had the training and capability to protect his patients while providing care. We exist so that no child ever has to grow up wondering why their parent died helpless. The senators conducting the hearing struggled to maintain their professional composure. Several were clearly moved by her testimony, by the combination of personal loss and professional mission that drove Merck's work. Even those skeptical of an organization operating outside government control had difficulty arguing against the fundamental premise that medical personnel in conflict zones deserve the ability to protect themselves. The hearing's conclusion, when it came 3 days later, represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to claim some measure of victory. Merck would be granted legal status as a recognized non-governmental organization with special operational authority. They would maintain their independence, but would provide quarterly reports to the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Their funding would continue through anonymous donors, but with tax-exempt status that recognized their humanitarian mission. Most importantly, the committee established what they called the Brennan-Granger Protocol, a framework for how military medical operations should incorporate self-defense capabilities while maintaining medical neutrality. It was named jointly for Dr. Brennan and Colonel Granger recognition of both their contributions to a new understanding of how humanitarian operations could function in modern conflict zones. Colonel Granger died 2 weeks after the congressional hearing, his heart finally giving out after months of fighting to see Mercy's mission secured. Dr. Brennan was with him at the end in a private room at the Montana facility where they'd built something remarkable together. The memorial service was attended by every MEARC member who could travel, a gathering of warrior healers who had committed their lives to the mission that Granger and Dr. Brennan had articulated. Declan attended the memorial, having made his decision during those long weeks of waiting. He wore his dress uniform but carried in his pocket the discharge papers that would separate him from the Navy with honor. It wasn't an easy choice. Leaving the SEALs meant abandoning a career and identity he'd built over a decade. But watching Dr. Brennan stand at Colonel Granger's grave, describing how he'd been more than a mentor, how he'd been the father she'd lost and could never replace, Declan understood that some missions transcended institutional loyalty. After the service, as people dispersed to the reception that followed any military memorial, Dr. Brennan found Declan standing near the grave marker that had been erected for Colonel Granger. It was simple but powerful: his name, his years of service, and beneath that a single line: he taught warriors to heal and healers to fight. "You're leaving the Navy," Dr. Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Somehow she already knew, perhaps through the same intelligence networks that had tracked him during his investigation. "Yes," Declan confirmed. "I've spent 10 years serving in ways that honored my brother's memory. But you've shown me a different way to honor what he stood for, not just avenging his death through military action, but preventing other deaths by ensuring healers can protect themselves." Dr. Brennan nodded slowly, her gray eyes studying him with an intensity that suggested she was making calculations beyond what he could see. "Colonel Granger's last words to me were about succession planning. He wanted to ensure Merck would continue after he was gone, that we'd have leadership capable of maintaining our mission against all the pressures that will inevitably come. He suggested I needed a deputy director, someone who understood both worlds, military and humanitarian, well enough to bridge them." She held out her hand, and in it was a patch, the Merck insignia, that combined a medical caduceus with a combat knife. "I'm not asking you to become a deputy director today, Declan. You're not ready for that yet, and frankly, neither am I ready to trust anyone that completely. But I am asking you to join MEARC as an instructor and operational coordinator. Teach our new recruits what you know about special operations. Help me figure out how to scale what Colonel Granger and I built from 147 people to the global organization it needs to become." Declan took the patch, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. This was the choice that Colonel Granger had framed in that Virginia parking lot, the decision between serving institutions and serving principles. It was the hardest choice he had ever faced, but also the clearest. "I'm in," he said simply. "All in, just like you said in Geneva. No halfway, no reservations. I believe in this mission with everything I have." Dr. Brennan's smile was genuine, warm, in a way he'd rarely seen from a guerrero. "Good, because we have a lot of work to do, Sergeant Reeves. Or should I say Director Reeves, that's your Merc title now. We've got 43 new recruits starting training next month, 12 of them from Caldwell's own CIA team who resigned rather than participate in his schemes. We've got emerging crisis situations in Syria and Sudan that need our attention. And most importantly, we've got a legacy to honor my father's, Colonel Granger's, your brothers, and all the healers who died because they couldn't protect themselves. 3 months later, Declan stood in the rebuilt Montana Facilities Training Center, watching a new generation of warrior healers learn the skills that would allow them to heal and protect in equal measure. Dr. Brennan had appointed him Director of Training Operations, responsible for ensuring every MERIC member could function as both a medical professional and a tactical operator. The facility had expanded since his first visit, growing from a single building to a compound that could house and train hundreds of personnel. The memorial wall that Declan had glimpsed during his evacuation now occupied an entire wing, 340 faces of military medical personnel who had died in conflict zones since 1990. Dr. Brennan's father was number 47, his photograph showing a young man with an honest smile and eyes full of idealism. Colonel Granger's photograph had been added to the wall, though, in a place of honor separate from the casualties. Beneath his image was a plaque with his final words to the organization he had helped build. We're not creating soldiers who can heal or doctors who can fight. We're creating something entirely new, guardians who understand that protecting life sometimes requires taking it, and that the highest form of service is ensuring healers never die defenseless. Brennan appeared beside Declan as he studied the memorial wall. She came here every morning before starting her day, he'd learned, spending a few minutes in contemplation before the faces of those whose legacy Merc honored. New mission brief came in overnight, she said, her tone shifting to professional mode. Hospital in Damascus, under threat from local militia groups. 200 civilians trapped, including 60 children. Syrian government can't or won't provide security, and traditional humanitarian organizations have pulled out. We're the only option. How many operators do we deploy? Declan asked, his mind already running through tactical considerations. 12 plus support personnel. You'll lead the mission. Consider it your final evaluation before we make your director position permanent. Keep the patients safe, maintain medical neutrality, and bring everyone home. That's the mission. Declan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with Merc leadership. Every decision he made would affect not just the immediate mission, but Mercy's broader reputation and capability. Dr. Brennan was trusting him with the organization's future, with the legacy that she and Colonel Granger had built. One more thing, Dr. Brennan added, her voice softening slightly. My father's medical bag, the one Colonel Granger gave me after Dad died. I want you to carry it on this mission. It's symbolic, but symbols matter. You're carrying forward what my father started, what Colonel Granger taught us, what your brother believed in. Make sure that bag comes home with everyone who depends on it. She handed him the worn leather medical bag, its surface bearing the marks of decades of use. Inside were modern medical supplies, but also artifacts from Dr. Michael Brennan's service. His instruments, his notes, his commitment to saving lives regardless of circumstances. As Declan prepared for the Damascus mission, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a SEAL whose entire identity revolved around direct action and special operations. Now he was leading a humanitarian mission that would require equal parts healing and fighting, protection and care. The helicopter lifted off from the Montana facility as dawn broke over the mountains, carrying Declan and his team towards Syria and the civilians who needed Merc's unique combination of medical expertise and tactical capability. Dr. Brennan watched from the command center, coordinating logistics and support with the same precision she'd shown during his first encounter with her. Through his headset, Declan heard her voice one final time before they entered communications blackout. Director Reeves, you asked me once what kind of hospital we run. The answer is simple. We run the kind that ensures healers never die helpless, that patients receive care regardless of danger, that medical neutrality is protected by people willing to fight for it. Bring them all home, Declan. That's what we do. That's who we are. As the Montana landscape disappeared behind them and the helicopter turned toward distant conflicts in desperate need, Declan understood that he'd found something he'd been searching for since his brother's death, a way to honor Jake's sacrifice that went beyond vengeance or military victory. Merc represented the future of humanitarian work in conflict zones, a model where healing and protection weren't separate missions, but two aspects of the same commitment. The Brennan-Granger Protocol wasn't just a congressional designation or organizational framework. It was a promise from one generation of warriors to the next, from healers who died defenseless to those who would ensure that tragedy never repeated. It was a legacy built on loss, but sustained by hope, funded by grief, but operated with purpose. And as Declan led his first mission as a Merck director, carrying Dr. Michael Brennan's medical bag towards civilians who desperately needed both healing and protection, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. Some missions transcended institutional loyalty. Some promises were more important than careers, and some legacies were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The helicopter disappeared into the distance, carrying guardian angels toward their sacred duty, protecting those who heal, healing those who suffer, and ensuring that medical personnel would never again face the choice between abandoning patients or dying helpless. It was the mission that defined Merck, the promise that sustained them, and the legacy that would outlive them all.